The train exhaled a long sigh as it came to rest at the station, a plume of smoke dissolving into the endless sky. Clara Whitfield sat still for a moment before rising, her gloved hands clutching the worn leather satchel that held her life's remaining belongings. She smoothed the folds of her dress, as if pressing down her nerves, then stepped onto the wooden platform. The boards creaked beneath her boots, and for an instant, she felt as though she had set foot on a stage, every eye watching, every whisper a note in some song she did not know the words to. The town was small, dust-laden, caught between the harshness of the frontier and the pride of survival. Wagons rattled past, a blacksmith's hammer struck iron, and women in bonnets paused their errands to stare. Clara carried with her the letters of a man she had never met. Ezekiel Tanner, farmer of this land, the promise of a home, a name, a place where her loneliness might end. She had traced his handwriting with her fingertips countless times, the loops of his letters almost tender. "I will be waiting at the station," one had said. But the station was empty of any welcoming smile. Her heart pounded, half in hope, half in shame. She craned her neck, expecting to see a familiar figure described in ink, a man of broad shoulders from work, with eyes honest as a sunrise. Instead, she found only strangers. It was Sheriff Amos Reed who approached her, his boots heavy, his mustache stiff with the dust of the day. He tipped his hat, not with warmth but with duty. "Miss Whitfield." "Yes," she said, her voice trembling more than she intended. He looked at her a moment too long, pity edging his eyes. "I'm sorry you came all this way. Ezekiel Turner, passed 2 weeks ago. Fever took him sudden." The words fell like stones in her chest. Passed. The letters she held were suddenly relics of a ghost. She clutched them tighter, as though her grip could change the truth. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You've no husband here now. Best make other arrangements." The stays grew heavier. Clara felt the sting of them on her skin. The men's curiosity, the women's judgment. A stranger who had crossed half the country for nothing. Her throat burned with unshed tears, but she did not cry. Not yet. She lifted her chin, though the weight of humiliation pressed it downward. It was then she noticed him. At the far edge of the platform, half in shadow, stood a figure taller than any she had ever seen. His skin was bronzed by sun and wind, his hair bound back, his presence both commanding and solitary. A scar ran along his jawline, catching the light like a pale river across stone. His eyes, dark and steady, were fixed not on her, but on the ground, as if refusing to meet the gaze of a world that had already condemned him. The townsfolk parted around him without a word, though their silence was sharp as a blade. She heard the whispers hiss through the air. "Comanche." Sheriff Reed followed her gaze and spoke curtly. "Best keep your distance from that one. He don't belong." But Clara, still trembling, saw something in the man's stance. Not threat, not pity, but solitude, vast and endless as the prairie itself. In that instant, their eyes did meet, just for a heartbeat. And though no word was spoken, Clara felt seen, not as a spectacle, not as a shame, but as a fellow outcast. The sheriff adjusted his hat. "There's a boarding house. Widow Crow runs it. I'll see you there." Clara followed, but her mind stayed behind, at the edge of the platform, where a scarred giant had stood like a sentinel against a world that refused him. The boarding house smelled faintly of soap and boiled beans. Mrs. Hattie Crow, tall and sharp-eyed, showed her to a small upstairs room. "So you're the one Turner was waiting for. Poor thing. Well, you'll have to find your own way now." Her tone carried both judgment and pity, a mixture Clara would soon learn was common here. That night, Clara unpacked her satchel, laying Ezekiel's letters on the bedspread. She read them again by lamplight, the words trembling in her hands. A farm of wheat and corn, the smell of soil after rain, a place where two people could make a life together. She closed her eyes and felt the ache of loss, not for Ezekiel himself, whom she had never touched, but for the dream he had carried for her. Outside her window, the prairie stretched wide under the moon, silent and merciless. In the distance, she saw a lone figure standing by his horse, the Comanche. He did not move, only gazed at the horizon as if guarding it. Clara pressed her palm to the window pane. In that lonely vigil, she saw not a savage, as the town whispered, but a man carved out of endurance. And somewhere deep inside her hollowed heart, a fragile thought stirred. Perhaps her journey had not ended with Ezekiel Turner's death. Perhaps it had only begun. The days that followed were long and airless. The town had a way of reminding Clara of a station without speaking a word. Doors closed softly in her face, eyes slid away when she entered, and yet the whispers lingered in the dust behind her. She tried to make herself useful. She offered to mend clothes, to teach children their letters, to scrub floors for coins. Some took her in for a day, then dismissed her. "We don't need the charity of a bride left unwanted," one woman muttered under her breath. Clara felt herself shrinking each day, her dreams unraveling stitch by stitch. At night, in her small room at the boarding house, she sat at the window, watching the prairie burn with sunsets vast enough to swallow her whole. And always, she noticed him, Chenoa, sometimes on horseback, sometimes tending a fire outside the town's edge, always alone, always enduring. It was on the 5th day that her hunger gnawed deeper than her pride. She had eaten little more than bread and broth since arriving, and her coin purse thinned to nothing. She sat outside the general store, staring at the ground, ashamed of the pity in Mrs. Crow's eyes when the widow pressed a slice of cornbread into her hand. That was when a shadow fell across her. She looked up and saw him. Chenoa did not speak at once. His silence was not the strained kind of man uncertain with words, but a silence chosen, as if words were precious and should not be wasted. He carried a small sack of grain over one shoulder, his frame towering yet unassuming. "You are hungry," he said at last, his voice low, shaped by a tongue both foreign and familiar. Clara stiffened. She felt the stays of townsfolk prickling her skin. "I'm managing." He tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes resting on her with neither judgment nor pity, only a stillness that made her want to weep. "Come," he said simply, and gestured toward the horizon. Her breath caught. To follow him would be to step further into exile, into whispers that already stung her like nettles. And yet, to remain was to wither beneath their gaze. She looked down at the crumbs in her lap, then back at him. Against every careful thought, she rose to her feet and followed. His land was not much, just a patch of soil stubbornly coaxed into growth, a rough cabin built by hands both skilled and scarred. It was far from town, where the grass bent in waves under the wind and the sky seemed endless. "You may stay," Chenoa said, leading her inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and earth. There was only one room, bare save for a hearth, a small table, and a bedroll in the corner. He motioned to the chair. "You rest. I will cook." Clara hesitated, but exhaustion overcame her. She sat and watched as he stirred a pot over the fire, movements quiet, deliberate. He placed a bowl before her, stew, simple but warm. She ate slowly, every bite a small act of surrender. In the days that followed, they settled into a rhythm of silence. She mended his shirts without asking. He left food for her before dawn. She swept the floor. He split wood. They spoke little, yet each gesture was its own language. One morning, she woke to find a clay cup on the table, filled with wildflowers. Their petals, fragile and bright, seemed almost out of place in the rough cabin. She touched them gently, her throat tight. When he returned from the fields, she did not speak of them, but her smile lingered longer than she intended. The land itself became their tutor. Chenoa showed her how to draw water from the well without spilling, how to listen for the call of birds that warned of storms, how to gather herbs that soothed an aching belly. Clara's hands grew rougher, her arms stronger. She began to feel herself less a ghost and more a body alive in the rhythm of toil. Yet the town did not forget. Once, when Clara rode beside Chenoa into the market, silence swept the street. Children stayed openly. Women pulled their shawls tighter. Men scowled. Mrs. Crow caught Clara's hand as she passed. "They'll never forgive you for it," she whispered. "You'll be branded, same as him." Clara's cheeks burned, but she did not pull away. When she returned to Chenoa's side, he did not ask what had been said. He only held the sack of flour steady in his arms and walked beside her as if the world beyond them did not matter. That night, by the fire, Clara stitched a tear in his shirt. Her fingers trembled at the roughness of the fabric, at the nearness of his arm. When she finished, she laid the garment beside him. He looked at her then, long and unblinking, and gave the smallest nod. It was not gratitude spoken, but gratitude felt. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the prairie in gold, Clara stepped outside the cabin. The wind lifted her hair, and for the first time since arriving, she felt something like freedom. Behind her, she heard the door open. Chenoa stood in the doorway, watching the horizon with her. His presence was steady, grounding, like the earth itself. "You came here for a husband," he said quietly. His voice carried no accusation, only truth. Clara swallowed, her throat tightening. "Yes," and found nothing. He turned his gaze to her then, and for the first time, she did not look away. His eyes were dark pools, filled not with possession but with understanding. "Sometimes," he said, "nothing is where we begin." She let the words settle into her bones. They stood together in the hush of twilight, the prairie wide around them, two souls bound not by promises, but by the quiet courage of survival. The prairie had a way of carrying whispers farther than shouts. Clara felt it every time she walked into town beside Chenoa, the narrowing eyes, the sidelong looks, the air thick with things unsaid. One evening, as they returned from the market, Sheriff Reed rode up on his bay horse, his badge catching the dying light. He pulled the reins sharply, dust swirling at their feet. "Chenoa," he called, his voice sharpened by authority. "Ranchers say a steer's gone missing. Hooves led toward your land." Clara stiffened, her heart quickening. She knew the accusation was nothing but a net thrown wide enough to snare. Chenoa's face remained still, unreadable. "I take no cattle," he said, voice steady as stone. Reed's eyes flickered to Clara. "And you," he said with a curl of his lip, "best be careful. Hitch your life to his, and you'll be dragged down when he falls." The words struck Clara with the weight of shame, but shame had become her familiar companion, and she no longer feared it. She lifted her chin. "If he falls, I fall beside him." Reed spat into the dirt and rode off, leaving the air thick with dust and warning. That night, Clara could not sleep. The wind rattled the cabin walls, restless as her thoughts. She rose, stepping outside into the cool air, only to smell something acrid, smoke. Her eyes darted to the barn. A faint glow bled through the cracks in its wood. Then, flames. "Chenoa!" she cried, her voice breaking the night. Together they ran, the dry grass crackling underfoot. Fire clawed upward, sparks scattering into the dark sky. The mule screamed inside, hooves striking in panic. Without hesitation, Chenoa pushed into the blaze, the fire licking his arms. Clara screamed after him, but moments later he emerged, coughing, dragging the terrified animal out by the halter. The flames leapt higher, devouring wood and hay. Clara grabbed a bucket, ran to the well, her hands blistering from the rope. Water sloshed, heavy, spilling over her dress. She ran again and again, throwing water that seemed swallowed whole by the inferno. Smoke filled her lungs, her legs buckled. Then strong arms lifted her. Chenoa, his face blackened, eyes burning not from the fire but from a deeper flame of will. He set her down safely, then turned back, refusing to surrender what little land they had. By dawn, half the farm lay in ruin. The barn was charred skeletons of wood, but the cabin still stood, blackened but unbroken. Clara sat on the ground, her throat raw, her dress scorched at the hem. Beside her, Chenoa crouched, his chest heaving, silent in his grief. She touched his arm, her fingers brushing the burns there. He did not flinch. For the first time, she dared to let her hand linger, not in pity, but in solidarity. "We still have the land," she whispered. His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment the distance between them, their histories, their wounds, their exiles, seemed to dissolve. Word of the fire traveled faster than the smoke. By midday, the town was buzzing. Some said it was an accident. Others muttered it was punishment, justice, the Lord's hand striking down what did not belong. Clara heard it all when she returned with Chenoa to buy supplies. Faces turned, whispers cut sharp, and then Sheriff Reed appeared again, flanked by 2 ranchers. "This ends now," Reed declared. "The town don't want you here. We won't abide cattle thieves," and his eyes slid to Clara, heavy with contempt, "and women who've lost their shame." The silence was suffocating. Clara felt her hands tremble. She knew this moment was the knife's edge, the place where silence would mean surrender. So she stepped forward. Her voice cracked at first, but she steadied it. "I came here for a husband, a farmer, a dream written in letters. That dream died before I ever stepped off the train." The townsfolk shifted uneasily, listening. "I found instead a man you call an outsider, a man who works the soil you would not touch, a man who saved my life when the fire raged, while others only whispered." Her eyes swept the crowd, daring them to meet her gaze. "You speak of shame, but shame is turning away from decency. Shame is cruelty disguised as law." Her words hung in the air like a bell tolling. For a long moment, no one spoke. The crowd looked from Clara to Chenoa, and though no hearts were won in a day, something cracked in the armor of their silence. Sheriff Reed's jaw tightened, but he did not press further. He turned his horse and spat. "You'll regret this, Miss Whitfield." But Clara did not tremble. She had found her ground. That night, back at the cabin, Clara and Chenoa sat in the hush of the prairie. The stars shone bright, sharp against the black sky, as if the heavens themselves bore witness. Clara looked at the fields, scarred by fire, yet still standing. She thought of a journey, of the girl who had stepped off the train with hope folded in letters, and of the woman she had become, forged in dust and flame. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "that the land chooses who can stay?" Chenoa gazed at the horizon, his profile cut by moonlight. "The land takes much, but it also gives, if you endure." She nodded, letting his words settle deep. Then, without thought, she reached for his hand. His fingers, calloused and scarred, closed gently around hers. For the first time since her arrival, she felt not like a stranger, but like someone who belonged. Closing reflection. Years later, Clara's voice would still carry the memory of that season. The West was not kind. It burned us, judged us, stripped us bare. But in the ashes, I learned this. Love is not what is promised, but what is proven day by day, in silence, in endurance, in fire. And sometimes, the loneliest souls find each other at the edges of the world, where judgment cannot reach, and where dignity grows like wheat from scorched earth. The final image lingers, Clara and Chenoa, side by side in the field, the horizon wide, the sky endless, their hands entwined as they begin again.